This is actually one of the hardest questions of like this alternative, because it does require getting a little bit, if not technical, just trying to do some kind of difficult philosophical work, because this is a huge problem, this meaning crisis issue, and it's not an accident. It's kind of the consequence of hundreds and hundreds of years of intellectual history and people making advances in our understanding of reality, but in the process breaking often our meaning systems that we've been using. And so to really understand kind of what's possible on the other side of where we're at, you do have to kind of go back and kind of see, how did we get here? So that would be where that question, I think, orients the conversation to, is like, has it always been this way, or is this some kind of aspect of something new about what, the last 50 years, the past 500 years? So real quickly, I mean, the way that I tend to go about it to frame that is saying that, no, this is very much an aspect of the modern condition. This is not just the human experience. This is a very particular, historically situated moment of being human in a particular kind of society that runs on a particular meaning operating system. And where that starts to really show up is in the move out of the medieval period and into the kind of early Enlightenment. So the dawn of modernity is where a lot of this stuff really comes onto the scene in a major way. And basically, the simple story that I like to tell is that, with, let's say, pre-modern thinking, meaning was very much a given. It was an element of reality. There was a God, and God made things, and God had a plan, and there was this great kind of chain of being. Everything had its right place. When you looked around the world, everything was sort of fulfilling a particular function. It was part of a cosmic story. And there were correspondences everywhere in a kind of magical way. Everything was sort of rich with significance. Everything was symbolic. And so meaning was just not a problem. It was everywhere. And so there weren't, in the kind of modern sense, many meaning crises that people were grappling with in that context. Other problems for sure, but meaning was sort of not the issue. Now what happens with like the early modern period is you start getting the philosophers starting to appreciate that we are subjects in an objective world that are interpreting our experience, and that if you start doing science, for example, and you're trying to get at what is out there, what's real, then you're not going to find meaning or value when you go to, measure the length of something or take something's temperature. And as science really got going, you had a bunch of ways of quantifying the kind of objective world, but what was missing from all of it was the deep stuff, was meaning, what was value. It was, the significance of things. And so you get this split in that early modern shift to a objective world in which subjects are participating and navigating and interpreting, but the real stuff is sort of the physical, kind of quantifiable, solid material things that we experience. And by contrast, the feelings and the senses of significance or valuation or bases of orientation, that was subjective. You can't look around and learn what you should do. David Hume was a philosopher, early modern thinker, who basically said you can't get an ought from an is. And what science was giving us was all these ises, and couldn't say anything about the oughts and about what matters, about what's significant, about what's valuable. So you get the subject-object split in a really profound way. And this just kind of grows and grows more extreme of a split. And it kind of withdraws meaning and value out of the world of real things into what we would just say is the subjective. And so then meaning becomes not just subjective, but just subjective. So, oh, you like that dish or that meal? Well, that's just subjective, This person doesn't. And in the same way, you think that that matters, well, this person doesn't. It's just subjective. So the reality of value and meaning just disappears into this realm of subjectivity, which is, in a sense, deemed less real and not something you can subject to the same kind of analysis or kind of rigor of, say, objective science. And this whole way of thinking about things leads to a mechanized notion of reality. It leads then to the rise of kind of a clockwork sense of how everything exists, emphasizing the material and the physical. And the whole kind of modern industrial world system that winds up arising is very much a product of that worldview, of that way of seeing things. And so as that unfolds and deepens, you then find an even further radicalization later on in what's called the postmodern shift from the modern to the postmodern, where now even the objective world starts to come under scrutiny, under questioning. Because who's to say what the objective world is? You know, you have a different experience of the objective world than I do. So actually, who's to say? And yeah, science does its thing, but who's to say that science is a better way of understanding reality than reading a poem or some ancient tale? These become just language games. And so, whereas in the modern world, meaning has sort of withdrawn into the subject, in the postmodern world, everything is just radically subjective and ultimately then radically relative. And no way exists to sort of judge between one perspective and another perspective. So you think that's valuable, you think that's valuable. And just as the modernists might say, well, people disagree, you say, oh, you say that's a reality, you say that's a reality, well, who's to say? So the whole objective space also then disappears, and we're left in a kind of radically ungrounded vertigo experience in its own way, where meaning and value are radically constructed and nothing really means anything. And that is kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. And we need to appreciate the legacy of that historical lineage of intellectual history that kind of got us here. And what I think is necessary, and what a lot of people are now naming and describing and articulating, is the next step in that process, which is actually a real healing step. You know, out of pre-modern sort of naive thinking about meaning and value, we got a more reflective modern perspective. And that was disenchanting, but it was also an insight about the nature of the relationship between subjects operating in the world. And out of the postmodern recognition that all those subjects have their own experiences of a perspective on that world, and that is an unavoidable aspect that you can't get out of. You can't jump to that, view from nowhere that the modernists kind of wanted to achieve and say that there's some ultimate, absolute, objective truth that we can know through science and quantifiable measures and this sort of thing. The postmodern view that things are always situated and contextual and need to be appreciated as such, that's also a real important insight. But that is not where the story ends, and you can carry both those major insights into something that deepens this idea even further. And that would be something like an emerging metamodern notion of meaning and value. And the major insight, I think, that the kind of profound takeaway that is being articulated by people operating in that new way of thinking is bringing together those two notions, but saying, okay, it's not that meaning and value are objective and just sort of given, the way maybe like a pre-modern way of thinking would have suggested. And it's not, though, just all in your head. It's not just subjective. The way that the modernists started to articulate it, and then the way that the postmodernists radicalized it. Meaning isn't objective, it's not out there, but meaning isn't just subjective, it's not just in here. So what is it? What it is it's a real relationship. It's a real relationship between a subject and the world that they're operating in. And that is neither objective nor subjective. It's a link between the two. It's a relationship that ties together a subject to the world in a particular way. And that has sometimes been referred to as a transjective way of thinking about meaning. And what's significant about it is that it resolves this profound challenge, this profound tension in the way that people were thinking about meaning and value. Because yes, just as the modernists noted, you can't just measure something and find its meaning, but that doesn't mean that it entirely withdraws into some radically subjective thing under the same category as do you like spaghetti or not. It's rather a way in which subjects relate to their reality, relate to their objective world in a way that allows them to be maximally, optimally viable and flourishing in that context. And that is actually a real thing. I can't just cut off my arm and say, it's all, that pain is just subjective. I can't walk into a wall and say, but this objective thing doesn't actually exist, because who's to say? There are actual constraints that the world imposes on us that have certain implications for us as subjects, as knowers, as participants in the world. And if we're actually going to be in a relationship with the world that increases our flourishing and well-being, that actually is valuable to us and is meaningful for us, then that's not arbitrary. There's actually certain ways to do that better or worse. And so the whole radical confusion around like, how should I be and what should I do starts to get some clarity for the first time, because you see that actually there is a kind of orientation we can carve out when we understand meaning and value in this way. And you start to see that the whole erasure of meaning and value from the world was this profound misunderstanding of something utterly essential. And so when we look out and see a world on fire and people suffering from a life of just drudgery and meaninglessness, and we see this collective system that we've created out of a perspective that has removed meaning and value from the world, well, it's no surprise that things are falling apart. But if we can appreciate how we can get out of that way of seeing, and we can actually say, hey, there's a very profound insight in the new way of justifying notions of meaning and value as real, not as subjective or objective, but as transjective, that can orient us to what actually matters. That can actually ground us in what is a real orientation towards the good or the better. And this could be world-changing, because it means that lived from that perspective, we have a notion now, we have a framework, a worldview that people can enter and rethink their entire lives and rethink what it is that they're doing. And if you actually say, hey, wait, it isn't all just who's to say, then like maybe that job that you're in that's polluting that river, maybe that actually matters, like maybe it's not, who's to say? And so maybe if you're just spending most of your time in the basement playing video games, eating Doritos, or in watching pornography, maybe that's not optimal for your well-being and flourishing. Maybe there are better or worse ways that we can move through existence. And maybe it's also not just about us in our subjective experience. Maybe it's about how we relate to other people. Maybe it's about how we relate to other life and other beings and other plants and ecosystems. Maybe all that actually matters. Maybe if I attend to that, I'll actually feel better and I'll actually be taking care of the things that are necessary for my well-being and flourishing. So it has the potential, I think, to radically transform not just our way of seeing the world, but each person's way of being in the world. And if you can transform people's way of being in the world by orienting it towards meaning and value as real, then I think we have a chance of transforming the world for the better and answering the profound crises and challenges that we're facing collectively today.